Welcome to this webinar on creating and adhering to an accessibility policy. Why make the web accessible? Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, was famously quoted as saying, "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." So the ethical reason it's the right thing to do is paramount. However, there are further benefits to accessibility. Increased business through a larger user base being able to access the website, and of course there is the legal requirement for accessibility under the Equality Act in the UK and similar acts abroad as well. So why is an accessibility policy needed? Web accessibility is about designing sites so as many people as possible can access and interact with them effectively and easily, independent of who they are or how they access the net. This is a key principle in developing an accessibility policy. This occurs throughout the website creation process, started as early as identifying the project requirements. In other webinars, we have looked at the responsibilities of different groups, designers, developers, testers, and so on. However, these only cover accessibility relating to these areas. Accessibility should be considered throughout the duration of a project, right through from initial requirements gathering through to UAT, launch, and even post-launch. You want to avoid the situation where you develop a website and find that it is inaccessible only after launch, and you then have to make reasonable adjustments which will inevitably be constrained by the design of the website. This would leave you potentially open to legal challenges. Because accessibility is a broad topic and not just a single step, this is why a policy is needed to document your approach so that it is implemented in a consistent way. So a typical policy outline, and this will vary from organisation to organisation of course, but the key ingredients in an accessibility policy will be something similar to the following. We have planning, standards, technologies, testing, staff training, and procurement. And we'll just have a walk through these different sections now. Having a budget in place allows you to commission accessibility audits, user tests, and so on. The size of this budget will be proportional to the size of the project and/or the size of your organisation. A larger organisation will be deemed to have more resources to spend on accessibility than a small organisation. It's useful to ensure that a particular person is designated as the key contact for accessibility. This accessibility lead can have overall knowledge of the ongoing accessibility work, act as a central contact for both internal staff and external contractors. And it's important to make it clear that accessibility is a requirement and not just a nice to have for all people involved in a project. Do note that accessibility really applies to all digital experiences, not just websites. So we're talking about mobile apps, email communications, PDFs, and so on. And if you're starting out from scratch with accessibility, this is your first foray onto it, it's going to be useful to introduce milestones by which you expect to achieve compliance to certain levels. And on the topic of levels, standards are something you will need to look at, in particular which standards you wish to adopt for your accessibility policy. Whilst you can develop your in-house standards, we strongly advise adopting WCAG 2 or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2 wholesale, or at the very least using them as the core component of your own standards. They've had a lot of work being put into them over the years in terms of developing them, so it's useful to tap into that and make them part of your own resource. Even if you do use WCAG2, it's still important that you create your own documentation for developers so you can use examples relevant to your own organisation, patterns, design patterns, how to implement them accessibly, and then how to test them as well. So it's really essential to take that into account. Also note that if you ever make use of third-party contractors and suppliers, you should be willing to share your documentation and standards with them. If they are creating content and functionality for you, you will want that to be developed to the same standard as content you're developing in-house. In terms of technologies, it's important to identify all the technologies that you use, and this will guide what best practices you will be looking to adopt for them. So technologies might include a CMS or any particular development frameworks that you make use of. in your development cycle. All of these will have an impact on how you can implement accessibility. For instance, you may opt for providing a style guide for users of your website CMS to help ensure content is created in a consistent fashion. Writers always include alt text for images, and so on. For developers, you might look to create a pattern library of accessible and well-tested patterns. This can help with the ongoing creation of accessible components. In the future, you may seek to use accessibility as a criteria for selecting technologies. If you are using existing technologies, you will need to look into how accessibility fits into them, whether it's a part of them, or whether it will guide you into sourcing new technologies in the future. Testing is really a critical part of ensuring the websites or products you develop are accessible. You will be looking to test against the standards that you've developed, so WCAG2 or your in-house standards, and the different stages at which you can actually test content will start right at the beginning from the requirements gathering throughout the development process. And you'll be using a range of tools and techniques to ensure this is thorough. So there are tools that will scan entire websites, and we'll look at those in a second. But it's important to not just rely on automated tools. There should always be a human factor involved in any testing. Now, this might require you to source training to help maybe train key QA staff or your accessibility lead. They can pass that knowledge on. But it's important that there is, at some point, some human-based testing for accessibility. Another aspect we find really useful is testing with disabled people. Now, there are organisations that offer that service for you, but it is something you can look to do yourselves, especially for large organisations with a big user base, with a big staff base. It is likely that you will have some staff with disabilities, and by all means see if you can ask them to help input into any website designs, any app designs, and so on. It's really useful to get that feedback from actual people, because at the end of the day, it is going to be people using your product. So do take that into account. And it's important as well to look at training to ensure your staff have the skills and knowledge to test effectively. Like I said, you may want to get an accessibility lead trained up so they can pass the knowledge on, but you can also bring in an external company to train numbers of staff at a time how to introduce accessibility into standard QA testing, how to develop accessibility, and so on. So it's going to be key to have a look at the stages at which accessibility can be incorporated into any testing. These will start right from the business requirements and the functional design, moving on to wireframes and visual designs, and any issues raised at the time of wireframes and visual designs will be much easier fixed at that point in the development cycle than later on once content has actually been developed. So it's really useful to get that early look at accessibility. Again, as soon as you have templates and coded templates put together, you can get those evaluated for accessibility as well. And of course, when you've got the site built, you can do a final user test on your website. But it's important to also note that accessibility testing does not stop once the site is launched. Sites are an ongoing process. Sites never remain static. The content is changed over time, designs change over time, and so on. And so you should have in place the ability and documentation covering post-launch accessibility testing of your content as well. It's really useful to make use of any bug tracking and issue tracking systems that you may use for development and use those to incorporate accessibility testing results as well. This makes it much easier to track and monitor progress of accessibility as it develops with your application. And if you're using an agile workflow, you may just wish to have a certain amount of time set aside per sprint. For instance, 1 day for a 2-week sprint would be reasonable to test components as they are developed, give them a visual check, give them a low-level code check, and even do some basic user testing with completed components. So testing, there are various ways of testing. You can use automated tools, which are essentially fire and forget. They allow you to point this tool at a website and it will scan the entire website and report back all of the issues that it can find on no matter how many hundreds or thousands of pages. That's a distinct advantage over manual testing, where it might not be possible to check more than 4 or 5 pages in a day. However, note that manual testing will cover pages to a much higher degree and will check things that automated tools cannot. So manual testing will make use of specialist tools, and we cover these in a separate testing webinar. So I'm just going to mention their existence here. But these specialist tools can allow QA testers, developers, to very easily evaluate a page for many accessibility requirements in one go. And also make sure you have documentation on how to use these tools as well. If you have staff turnover, then as new people come in, they will want to know how to use these tools, how to evaluate websites for accessibility, how to conduct an accessibility test, and so on. And these should be bespoke to your set of standards as well. These should describe how you want this testing to take place, what tools you want people to use, how you want them to use those tools, how you want them to report issues as well. And this consistency is really key in ensuring that website accessibility is consistent going forward. I mentioned briefly staff training in the various aspects, but it's important to also have a test plan, identify who needs to be trained, how much they need to be trained, and then check, is this something that you can deliver internally? Do you have the expertise to deliver this training? If not, you will need to look externally, see if you can outsource it to a third party, and this will require a budget resource as well. It is often likely that you will need to source external help in providing this training. And it may be that you need to seek the support of senior management. It's worth noting they should be on board with any promoting accessibility within your organisation, and as such they should be able to support you in getting assistance for any training needs and ensuring that budget is provided for you. In terms of procurement, when you are sourcing content, functionality, expertise from third parties, it is going to be essential that any products and services you source meet the same standards that you are developing to yourselves. So you will want to share your requirements and your standards with these third parties. You will also want to make sure that adherence to these standards is reflected in any contracts, and on top of that, have some means of verifying when a product is delivered to you, have some means of verifying that those standards have been followed. This again might be something you can do in-house if you have a dedicated QA team, but it may be that you need to enroll or enlist the help of third-party expertise who can conduct a standalone accessibility review and give you reassurances that your standards have been followed. Now, all of these aspects we've looked at are really relating to your own in-house accessibility policy, which will be the framework for you in creating accessible products and developing with accessibility in mind, and basically managing your entire approach towards accessibility within your organisation. But it's similarly useful to have a public policy as well. This is where you can state to the public on your website, in an About Us section on your application, and you can state to the public what your approach to accessibility is, what standards you adopt, and importantly, giving people the means to contact you should they have any difficulties using your site, using your application relating to accessibility. I mentioned earlier on the importance of disabled user testing. By encouraging users and giving them an easy method to feed back to you, you are basically tapping into free user feedback, which is invaluable. It's a very simple trick to do, and a public accessibility policy does not need to be long at all. It can be just a few paragraphs outlining what standards you've chosen, what testing you've done, what conformance level you expect you've achieved, and finally just adding in some contact details so users can let you know of any difficulties using your site so that you can go ahead and fix those issues, making your site more usable for people in the future. So I do hope this short webinar has been useful. If you do have any questions after this point, please do direct them to your line manager and they can forward them on to us for a response.